right, welcome to the AI and Big Data in Finance webinar. We're delighted today to have two distinguished speakers. Michael Weber from Chicago Booth will present his paper, ChatGPT and Corporate Policies, and Alejandro Lopez Lira from the University of Florida will be the discussant. So Michael here is going to have 30 minutes to present his paper. After 15 minutes, I may briefly interrupt in case the audience has any clarifying questions. Alejandro will then have 20 minutes for his discussion. And afterwards, we're going to open the floor for questions from the audience. As audience, please submit your questions in the Q&A. I will then call on you during the questioning part of the webinar. The presentation and the discussion are recorded, and together with the slides, they're going to be posted on our website. After the main part of the webinar, we're going to have an unrecorded discussion where everyone in the audience will have a chance to be upgraded to be a panelist, and then we'll be able to interact and exchange with Michael and Alejandro. So Michael, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much, Leah, on behalf of the organizing committee for having our paper on kind of like this great webinar today. Let me share my slides. Perfect. Can you see them in full screen? Perfect. Okay, great. So like this is joint work with Manish, who is, I guess, currently in Korea presenting, Jan Lin and Bao Song, who are all three at Georgia State. And so like, the starting point, too fast. The starting point of kind of like our paper is kind of like, if you think about kind of what I would say now, I don't know, my colleagues in corporate typically ponder about most of their time is, I don't know, one of the classical questions in corporate finance, like, how much do firms want to invest and, at which point and how do they finance it? But also like, from a more aggregate perspective, like from the macro perspective, like, the most cyclical component of GDP is ultimately firm investment. And it's also kind of like a key determinant for firm growth and business dynamism. Now, if you step back for a second and kind of like, put on a head of a theorist, like, under at least kind of like an ideal world, ultimately there's nothing to do for you empirically because like, there's a very stark prediction that, the only thing you would really kind of need to observe is Tobin's Q, meaning like, Tobin's Q is a sufficient statistic for firm investment. And so like, once you observe Tobin's Q, like you should have like a perfect kind of explanatory power of corporate investment. Now, of course, like, we all understand there's measurement error in Tobin's Q. There might be financial constraints. That's maybe why cash flows matter and all of that type of stuff. But at the same time, another reason why maybe Tobin's Q might not be a sufficient statistic is that maybe I, as a firm manager, as a CFO, let's say, I might have some private information that I haven't yet shared with market participants. Maybe markets are not strong form efficient, so they do not have access to my private information. So like, maybe there's scope for new information being kind of disclosed to market participants. And if we were able to survey, let's say, CFOs, we would potentially be able to extract their private information for future corporate policies, in particular for future investment. Now, one way via which managers, of course, can convey, to the extent they want to do so, their private information is via corporate earnings calls. Now, of course, you could say, well, look, maybe those earnings calls, they have been around for a while. People have used them extensively to kind of also extract measures of kind of like, uncertainty and similar type of things. But, to extract and analyze them at scale, I would argue maybe hasn't really kind of been feasible until the kind of advent of large language models, in particular in our case, ChatGPT. And so like, what we ultimately want to do, we kind of want to feed in to ChatGPT those earnings calls transcripts, and then kind of like, want to ask ChatGPT to provide us answers at the level of human experts. Now, specifically what we're after is kind of like, we want to extract from those earnings calls transcripts with ChatGPT at the firm quarter level forecast for future investment policies. And then kind of like, first start to a little bit kind of like, have a look at some plausibility checks and the time series across industries, and then ultimately see whether indeed it has predictive power for future realized investments. So specifically, the questions we are after is that whether ChatGPT can in fact actually create a meaningful measure of future firm investment. Then in the second stage, we want to verify whether this measure also has kind of like explanatory power for future capex once we condition on known determinants of firm investment, in particular Tobin skew, maybe a total Tobin skew taking into account like intangibles, correcting for measurement error in Q, or also potentially for proxies of financial constraints and also firm cash flows. And then linking it back a little bit to the Q-type investment theory, whether we also can actually see whether this ChatGPT investment score has predictive power for future realized investment as a future realized returns as a proxy for expected returns, but then also announcement returns and updates in analyst forecast. Not just kind of like in one plot graphically in the time series, what you see here in green is kind of X post realized future capex, like depicted on the right axis. On the left, this is averaged at a quarter level across all firm transcripts, the ChatGPT kind of extracted investment score. And what you see is a score that is extracted in the current quarter, meaning like earnings call in the next quarter about the current quarter, and then like 2 quarters ahead to like 2 + 4 quarters ahead investment growth. You do see when ChatGPT extracts on average a low score, indeed subsequently realized corporate investment is in fact like a low going forward. Very strong negative correlation. One concern of course is that maybe ChatGPT kind of knows the exposed history, and so I'll spend quite a bit of time trying to alleviate these concerns. That's effectively just kind of using data in the aggregate, but we ask about firm level investment, but I'll come back to that in a little bit. Now then actually a few additional kind of results before going into the details. Let me see whether I can just hide floating meeting controls. Perfect. We then also take overall capex and look at different subcomponents. You do see actually the investment score has predictive power for also the intangible and the R&D investment part of overall investment. I think the part what I think is kind of somewhat unique to kind of our paper is the fact that we have a direct measure of what CFOs actually say. It's also kind of useful because ChatGPT actually doesn't have access to that type of data because the microdata is not publicly posted. So we can directly correlate at the firm quarter level for a subset of our overall survey sample, what CFOs say in the Duke CFO survey and what ChatGPT tells us they said in the earnings call. We also find that the high ChatGPT investment score predicts lower future returns consistent with kind of a Q-type model. And we also see that, in kind of the cross-section of firms, the predictive power is in fact is stronger where you would expect it to be stronger. If you think about kind of a very mature firm, where maybe investment opportunities are already small to begin with, or a pretty big firm that has tons of analysts covering it and all of that, you would maybe not expect there's tons of private information, whereas for smaller firms, new kids on the block, maybe actually there's stronger predictive power. And that's indeed what we see in the cross-section. Now let me just kind of tell you a little bit more about the type of data we are using. So we downloaded via Seeking Alpha all earnings calls transcript for publicly listed firms in the US. Then we got the microdata from the Duke CFO survey. That's at the firm level. We use standard financial data from Quest Compustat. And so our main sample ultimately consists of roughly 75,000 firm quarter conference call observations between 2006 and 2020, representing a little bit less than 4,000 unique firms. Now, let me tell you a little bit kind of when we feed in the text to ChatGPT, we were working when we wrote the paper with ChatGPT 3.5. So we needed to take the overall transcript, separate it into different chunks, typically between 3 and 4 different chunks of the earnings call transcript. And then we were asking ChatGPT, like, imagine like you're a finance expert. We now feed you an earnings call transcript, and now only using that type of text. What do you think, is the firm planning to do in terms of like its capital expenditure over the next 12 months? Then we provided with the answer choices, increase substantially to decrease substantially. We also tell it how it should in fact actually provide the answer. It should be in the format of kind of like choice explanation. And if no relevant information is provided in a given earnings chunk transcript, it should respond no information is provided. Of course, naturally, not in all earnings calls a CFO will talk about investment, in particular if it's just some type of replacement investment. It's not worthwhile spending time on that. So, most likely the type of stories that are kind of conveyed in these calls are large multi-year investment packages. But even if those type of kind of announcements are made, they will be in maybe in one chunk of the transcript and not in all 4 chunks for a given firm quarter. Meaning like realistically, many of the individual kind of like subsets of a firm quarter investment transcript will actually in fact have a 0 transcript. As I alluded to, so like we use kind of 12,500 word chunks, typically between 3 and 4 chunks for a given firm quarter. We then kind of like assign a score of -1 if ChatGPT tells us that it identifies that CapEx will decrease substantially over the next 12 months, a score of +1 if it identifies the firm to increase investment quite substantially. And then in our baseline measure, what we do, we just kind of average at the firm quarter level across the different scores for the different chunks of the overall transcript. We also have kind of like, different measures where we say we use the maximum of the absolute scores for the different given firm quarter level, and results actually are pretty consistent across the different measures because ex ante it's unclear what the best aggregation of the different scores would be. Let me just show you like how the different kind of like answers are kind of distributed. Maybe not too surprising, like in 3/4 of like the text chunks, you see that, there's no change, including like no information is provided. And then it's kind of like, equally distributed between decreases and increases. Now, if you like average at the firm quarter level, you see that it's roughly like, 50% of the firm observations. That's still actually, you don't have any discussion about firm investment. But again, like, maybe not too implausible given that, as a manager, you only start talking about those plans if indeed, like, it's worthwhile spending time on that. And for the remaining 50%, it's roughly, again, equally distributed between decreases in investment and increases in investment. So now what I want to do in like the next couple of minutes, just kind of like, maybe provide some, plausibility checks or kind of descriptive pattern of this investment store to kind of like, maybe give us a little bit of a better understanding what's driving the time series in the cross section. So like, the first thing we do now focus on firms for which firm quarter observations for which ChatGPT identifies a score of 1 or -1 and look at bigrams of those text chunks, and you see like, if ChatGPT identifies like, a certain chunk as kind of decrease investment substantially, you see like, there's stuff about cost reduction, significantly reduce, substantially reduce, and so on. Whereas like, for chunks that are associated with a substantial increase, you see a revenue growth opportunity, term growth, and so on. So like, maybe meaningfully, even we as kind of humans would maybe say, well, left chunks, substantial reduce, right chunks, substantial increase. Also, just to give, a carefully hand-selected, examples, like, here again, first the substantial increase, you see, the text chunk has like, we have several key strategic initiatives to sustain growth. we plan to make significant capital investment, whereas for substantially decrease, we see like, CapEx will be down substantially. If I was to read the text, maybe I would also assign a score of -1. So again, like, of course, singletons that are carefully hand selected. Now let's look a little bit about yes.
Michael? Quick question from the audience, and feel free to delay if you think this is better to keep this in the end, but it may be relevant now. So conference call is public information. This is a question from the audience. Conference call is public information. How does ChatGPT discover new information that's not noticed by investors and analysts?
That's an excellent point. So like I come back to the analyst part in a second. So like, when we later do like the forecast of future investment, we take Tobin's Q right before the earnings call. And, relative to that information set, it's new information. Like what we, however, also do, we look at the update of analysts' forecast for CapEx after the call relative to before. And you, in fact, see like, it's not that ChatGPT discovers new information relative to after the earnings call, because analysts, in fact, actually do incorporate that information into their information set. But I'll come back to that in the next couple of slides. Thank you. Now here, what I wanted to kind of just allude to is kind of like maybe some plausible kind of like aggregate and across industry variations. So like as we saw earlier in the time series plot already, like, the great financial crisis, very bad times for future investment. But then if you look maybe across industries, in particular for retail and wholesale, whereas like maybe healthcare and pharma, pretty good, maybe just pre and during the COVID-19 pandemic, at least relatively speaking. So now what I want to do is kind of like at the firm level for a subset of our sample, kind of directly compare what ChatGPT extracts relative to what CFOs say in the Duke CFO survey. So like, we use this question from the Graham Harvey survey relative to the previous 12 months. What will your company's percentage change be during the next 12 months? In our case, in particular for capital spending. And, those kind of CFO surveys are, of course, pretty costly in terms of like even in an extensive margin reaching CFOs. Like it's a way smaller sample. We have roughly 1,700 firm quarter observations. That's why I also think, there's definitely scope in trying to create a measure for all publicly listed firms, because at scale, you couldn't actually do that using directly firm surveys. And here's, simply what we are doing. We do some form of portfolio sort, in the sense that we bunch firm quarter observations into different buckets based on whether kind of like we have a very negative outlook for future investment based on the ChatGPT score, or a very positive outlook. And then we simply collapse the data at the firm quarter level based on this outlook, based on ChatGPT. And we want to see kind of what the Duke CFO survey is telling us. And you do see like this monotonicity in terms of like, if ChatGPT says, will be kind of really bad going forward. Indeed, CFOs also say like, in terms of quantitative outlook, they want to decrease their investment by, I don't know, like 9%. Whereas like for firms for which ChatGPT identifies a pretty strong kind of like outlook for CapEx, you also see indeed like CFOs say a number larger than 10%. So now what I want to do is kind of take the firm quarter score for a given quarter T that is then kind of in quarter T plus 1 disclosed via the earnings call, and see whether in T plus 2 it helps us to predict capital expenditure growth over the next 4 quarters relative to the previous 4 quarters, and directly also kind of conditioning on kind of known determinants of CapEx, including also kind of like, some firm fixed effect to kind of like take into account that there's maybe systematic heterogeneity in their investment propensity across firms, but also like, aggregate effects that we saw like the Great Recession and so on. And so like, what I want to show you here is like, first, this positive correlation, like firms that have a higher ChatGPT investment score for quarter T, which we measure using earnings calls transcript in T plus 1. And then we look at CapEx growth over the quarters starting in T plus 2 over the next 4 quarters relative to the previous 4 quarters in the raw data when we just affirm in the time fixed effect, conditioning on Tobin skew, but also like potentially on kind of, I don't know, measures of like maybe associated more with financial constraints, and take into account that, of course, many of these large scale investment projects tend to be kind of like multi-year projects, so lacked capital expenditure. And like in terms of economic magnitude, the 1 standard deviation increase in the ChatGPT investment score is associated with kind of like a 3 to 5% standard deviation increase in capex over the subsequent quarter. And maybe to kind of like, give you a feeling, is this big, is this small? That's roughly to 2/3 to 100% of the corresponding sensitivity to movements in total Q. Now, what I want to show you here is like, I want to look at the longer term predictability. You do see like, this predictive effect is actually there in the data, and at some point kind of like, fizzles out after like 10 quarters. So in that sense, it's not just a short-term phenomenon, but again, I think that's plausible given that those large-scale projects that CFOs talks about likely are kind of like longer multi-year investment packages. Now, looking at different subcomponents, you do see like, overall physical investment, intangible investment, R&D investment can be a kind of positively correlate with the ChatGPT investment score, but it's strongest for physical investment, in fact. Now, one thing from an asset pricing perspective, like what we want to look at, so like, what does Q kind of tell us? If I as a manager think that my future expected cost of capital will be lower, firms' investment opportunities become larger, and I should in fact actually invest more. Saying it differently, if I say in an earnings call I want to invest a lot, that should be a signal about lower future expected returns. It's kind of like a Q theory type rationalization of like, for example, the value premium. So like, what you see here, it's indeed that if ChatGPT investment score is high, we indeed predict lower future returns. And again, it's kind of like a pretty kind of persistent effect that lasts for several quarters. Now, another thing is like I want to look at, rather than like the multi-quarter return, I want to look at the flip side. If it is the case that around earnings calls, managers disclose via their investment plans that their expected returns in the future are lower, yes, that should mean that upon announcement, the stock price should jump, or saying it differently, there should be a positive cumulative abnormal return in narrow windows around those earnings calls. You do see indeed in the 1 day after the earnings call, the ChatGPT investment score positively correlates with cumulative abnormal returns. That's true in the raw data, but also once you condition on the sentiment in the kind of like earnings call transcript. Or also, for example, if you say, well, let's directly condition on the very earnings surprise that is kind of displayed in the very earnings call. And so you see, like, consistent with kind of Q-type theory, high investment score firms, lower long run returns, but upon impact or announcement, positive cumulative abnormal returns. Now, as I alluded to at the very beginning, you wouldn't expect necessarily that this investment score has necessarily predictive power equally for all firms in the cross section. If you think about firms that are maybe kind of like, cash cows, not much investment opportunities on the one hand, managers might never talk about kind of investment project, but at the same time, it might also be pretty clear to financial market participants and analysts following them what kind of like their business model is and what they are doing. Whereas like, for firms that are kind of like pretty innovative early in their kind of life cycle, both for a firm, but also in terms of innovation and product life cycle, or maybe that are pretty opaque and small and very little coverage, maybe, managers have an incentive for these type of firms to kind of like display their private information more in earnings calls. So what we now want to do is kind of like look at interaction effects and see whether indeed there's interesting heterogeneity in the predictive power of the ChatGPT investment score for future investment based on kind of like which type of firms we are looking at. So like if you look at measures of market concentration and HHI of sales for all publicly listed firms with all the issues that might come with it because it's only publicly listed firms, or like a top 4 firm concentration ratio at the industry level using data for private and public firms from the Bureau of Economic Analysis, you tend to see like the predictive power is stronger for firms in more competitive industries and for smaller firms. And then if you look at kind of like, where are firms in their life cycle using measures from Hoberg and Phillips, you tend to see again like the correlation is stronger for firms that are early in their product innovation life cycles, whereas you do not see any kind of differential predictive power for firms that are mature or in declining stages of their life cycle. Now, I was actually alluding to that in the response to the question from the virtual floor. So like what we are doing here now is because like at the end of the day, it's not private information anymore. Once the analyst, once like the CFO talks about it in the earnings call. So like we are just using ChatGPT to systematically extract the type of information and just to kind of like verify that it's not private information anymore and to see whether indeed market participants kind of like update the information set based on what is talked about in the transcript. Here we use kind of like analyst forecasts for future capex as a proxy for the information set of market participants. And you do indeed see that a positive ChatGPT investment score measured based on the transcript correlates positively in like the update of forecast by analysts in the quarter afterwards relative to the quarter before for future firm capex. So like indeed, analysts kind of come to maybe a very similar conclusion as what ChatGPT is getting at. This is also like, one brief thing I wanted to mention in the last 2-3 minutes, kind of like, is ChatGPT maybe just using the ex post history to kind of make forecasts? So like, here what we are doing, we use now or exploit the fact that the training sample of the version of ChatGPT we are using ended in Q3 of 2021. So therefore we can actually now use 5 quarters of data to kind of like, verify that even like using data that GPT didn't have access to, we still find very similar correlations. And indeed, like in that out of sample test, you see this positive correlation still holds up. Another kind of test we did, maybe a poor man's version to kind of like falsify the identity. We just kind of like, deleted each type of identifiable information from the transcript, meaning like any kind of name of a manager, of a product, of a firm, of a location, and so on. And then again, you still see, this is only for a 10% random subset of the overall sample, you see this positive correlation, which again in economic magnitudes is very similar to our overall sample. And so now in the last minute, let me just briefly mention other things we've been working on. So like, the title is about corporate policy. So far, I only talked about firm investments. Maybe we should take that into account when rewriting the draft. But we also have evidence that ChatGPT dividend score can actually predict future dividends, and the ChatGPT employment score can predict future employment at the firm level. You can kind of saturate the specification by even more covariates. You can also do a little bit kind of horse race with other large language models, like for example, Roberta. Also kind of like can create an investment score that can predict future investment, but in a horse race, the ChatGPT investment score seems to have an edge. And as I alluded to, like, nothing hinges on maybe what you think might be a peculiar average kind of measure at the firm quarter level. You can also use the max of the different measures for the different chunks at the firm quarter level. And so like, let me wrap up to try to stay on time. So like, what we try to do in this paper is kind of like to see whether kind of ChatGPT systematically can extract information in public disclosures by CFOs and earnings calls. And, we seem to find that, measure of an investment score extracted by GPT has actually predictive power for firm investment, also correlates meaningfully across industries and over time, but crucially also is correlated with actually what managers themselves tell us for the small subsample for which we have an overlap with a kind of CFO survey. And we think actually, like, that's kind of pretty exciting because, like, in ages when it's maybe really hard to reach corporate insiders, but also when it's kind of like when we see in the aggregate, even the pure flavor statistics has a hard time with declining survey response rates. Maybe actually we can get up and use ChatGPT to get us what we are maybe trying to do in surveys. And so, like, let me maybe stop here and stop sharing. And now I'm really looking forward to Alejandro's comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael, for this great talk. Very clear, very interesting. Alejandro, you can share your slides and you'll have 20 minutes to discuss the paper.
Can you confirm that you can see my slides?
Yes, all good. Perfect.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me to discuss this paper. I found it to be very interesting, very relevant. It's funny because it feels like, ChatGPT came ages ago, but because of the publication process, it takes a long time to get the papers ready. So I usually like to have a framework for this type of papers, right? So like, it's kind of like necessary conditions for artificial intelligence / machine learning papers, right? And the conditions are: one, the paper explores an interesting question. I think the answer is yes in this case. Two, the paper shows that the proposed method worked well and better than existing techniques applied in the literature. I think the paper could do a little bit more in this, and obviously the method has to work out of sample or after the knowledge got update if using LLMs, right? And the third one is that results using the new method give us new and different economic insights compared to old methods, not just a more precise measure, right? So not just better results or showing that we can achieve something. What are the new insights? I usually use this to test the PhD students' ideas before they start working on the paper or before they have their draft, right? So I do think that this paper explores an interesting question, right? It's like, can ChatGPT extract meaningful forward-looking information about corporate policies directly from the text of earnings conference calls? And does this information have predictive power for actual outcomes and market reactions, right? And the way the authors tackle this issue is, they investigated ChatGPT can extract information about companies' future corporate policies, especially investment from earnings calls. They also do a little bit more about dividends and labor, if I remember correctly. And then test if this AI extracted information predicts actual future investments, stock market reactions, and whether it offers insights beyond traditional metrics like Tobin's Q, right? And as I mentioned before, they look at dividends and unemployment. Yeah. So I like to think of the paper as extracting managers' information rather than ChatGPT's scores. So I would say something like ChatGPT extracted its scores, rather than these are the scores about ChatGPT, right? Data is fairly standard earnings call transcripts from like Seeking Alpha. Notably, this information is on the web and therefore probably on the training data of all large language models. Duke CFO survey responses, standard financial data, right? And basically, because the older models do not have like that big of a context window, how much text you can fit into them, they divided the transcript into manageable text chunks, and then prompted ChatGPT per chunk to assess firm's capital spending plan with 5 options, and to provide an explanation. I'll come back to this later. Then the choices to numerical scores, and then average scores from all chunks for a single quarter score. Yeah, so this is super standard, and they evaluate with Duke CFO survey responses. I would actually like to see if the Duke CFO survey responses predict returns, for example, given that it is future investment, right? And they do correlate. So that'll be a nice placebo test. And then some like textual explanations. It's always tricky. This is, I think the authors did a good job. Yeah, they have a brief theoretical model. I really like the way it's presented because it takes like 2 pages. So that's nice, but it also delivers clear implications, right? So that's nice. And then They use a bunch of well-presented by Michael regression analysis and tested whether these scores predict future capital expenditure, controlling for the variables that you would think are reasonable to control for, whether this score predicts short-term stock returns or on earnings calls, and longer-term or abnormal returns, consistent with the classical intuition, and whether this predicted power varies with information environment, to see if it's like, oh, maybe it's overlooked information from the market, right? Yeah. And then there's a bunch of robustness on extensions, right? So obviously they do have like a very nice application of in finance, right? Like to apply generative AI to extract like these materials expectations. So I think that's super fun. They do have like this real-time investment proxy, right? You can just compute this 1 second after the transcript is done. And they try to do a little bit with explanation. Yeah. Okay, right. So I'm going to skip to the second part, right? Does the paper show that the proposed method works well and better than existing techniques applied in literature? And does the paper show that the method works out of sample or after the knowledge cutoff date if using large language models, right? Which is just out of sample, but spelled out. So for this, I actually was working on a recent new paper that's called the memorization problem. And basically what we show in that paper is that these models have memorized most of the internet, and we show it just explicitly. So like if you ask, for example, to recall exact numerical values like the S&P 500 at a given date from their training data, they're extremely good at it, right? Because of this, it's difficult to distinguish genuine forecasting from recall for periods with the training data, right? Because success may be more memorization. Moreover, there's motivated reasoning, which means that LLMs might construct narratives by working backwards from memorized outcomes, and they cannot really listen to the instructions to ignore data. It's like do not think about a pink elephant, right? It just doesn't work. And LLMs, because they've seen this data, they can just basically de-anonymize this massive data, like the conference calls, right? So our recommendation is to test on data entirely post-knowledge cutoff, at a minimum test for memorization, but I'll explain a little bit why I don't think it's that big of an issue here, right? So just they do know the numerical values. If you plot like actual price versus recalled price, they're gonna basically coincide a lot, right? And if you try to do some like anonymization and masking, right? Like, in this conference calls, like everything was supposed to be anonymized, including like the divisions, like the numbers, etc. And yet the model is just, they've seen this data. So their task is to memorize the whole internet, right? So correctly identify that this was like ethanol in Q1 2018, despite no obvious clues. Right, but the model has seen, where the sentence "our adjusted EPS of" appears of, right, and it can just backtrack. More importantly, when is memorization a problem, right? So memorization is not. It's always an issue if you want to forecast, right? I don't think it's an issue for tasks like information extraction or generating numerical scores, unless knowledge of the future would change the large language model's answers. Yeah, so the test is simple. It's like, if knowing the future would change your answer now, then it's an issue, right? Like, something bad is asking LLM to forecast the future during the training period, right? Because they just know it, and either they're just pretending they do not remember the information and they're just making something up, or they're just using the information anyway. Maybe bad, not always, is asking LLM to extract information from the text. Right, and it's a little bit like instrumental variables. There's no formal test. It's more of a economic reasoning. Is would knowledge of the future change the answer today? Right. In this particular case, the task is to classify managerial intentions. So how does the firm plan to change its capital spending over the next year? Right, based on the call transcript. At the first glance, on second glance, this looks more of an information extraction or classification task than a direct forecast, like predicts firm's capital spending over the next year, right? If it was just like, here's some information, predict firm's capital spending over the next year, that would not go great, because the models know the capital expenditure over the next year, even if it's not like firm by firm, they know, that COVID happened, that the financial crisis happened, etc. Right? Now, the only trick is like if ChatGPT knows how the firm's investment actually turned out or how the stock performed after the call, it might subtly influence its classification of the original statement of intent. So, the example is like, oh yeah, we're planning to increase investment in AI, right? And if ChatGPT knows when that that call was made and that there was a lot of investment in AI after, it may say like, oh, you know what, this is actually a stronger predictor of firms' capital investment than what's actually revealed in the call. It's very tricky. The analogy is instrumental variables, but it's not obvious that this is what ChatGPT would be doing. But for instance, a vaguely positive statement might be scored higher if the large language models know the outcome was very positive ex post. Right. So this is the prompt, just structured from the paper. So basically, you're a finance expert. Based on this text only, please answer the following question. The based on this text only just does not work because ChatGPT has memorized the full set of information in the internet, right? So it will just use all of its knowledge to do it. It maybe try to pretend not to, but it's like if I ask you, oh, pretend you do not know economics. Now tell me how would, like, I don't know, an increase in investment change the stock price in the future. If you do know what's happening, you're just gonna make a story up that may or may not be reflected, right? Then the question is, how does the firm plan to change its capital spending over the next year? I do not love that phrasing because the two sentences together kind of like ask the model to extract from the text, but I do not believe the first sentence is that great. So what I would have really liked is like, how does the firm describe to change its capital spending plan for the next year, right? Because then it's someone ambiguously. You're just asking the model to say like, oh, how are the managers describing its future plans rather than how is the firm planning to change? It's a little bit subtle. Another minor thing is that the format for the answer to each question is like choice and then explanation. So because these models are autoregressive and they predict the next word based on previous words, if it first gives you the choice, like increase, then its explanation will be like, motivated reasoning. Why is that? Yeah. So like once it commits to one sentence, it cannot change. Sometimes it's better. Sometimes it doesn't make a difference. I think for this question is like pretty straightforward. So I do not think it will make a lot of difference. Right, and obviously the training data it is on most of it. So like for most of the main analysis period, which is 2006-2020, it's within ChatGPT 3.5 training data, right? So I think the best defense against is like arguing why like knowing the future information and the future investment plans would not change the outcome of the model's answer, right? The instructions to use text only are usually broadly ineffective. We have a formal test in our paper. And the simple intuition is that the model knows everything. So if you just ask it not to use the information, it's not obvious that it can do it, right? Masking anonymization, I do not like that part specifically. I do not think it's that it works that well because large language models may just be able to de-anonymize everything in here. We do suggest like testing how effective this anonymization is. So like anonymize and try to duck out the specific information, although we do have a formal test like that in our paper. Obviously, the best recommendation is use the out-of-sample testing, right? And for this particular case, the very good news is that they will run the main analysis post ChatGPT 3.5 cutoff. So these models are trained with all the data in the internet, but only up until to a certain date, so like September 2021, right? And then the main results are robust in these restricted samples. So I do really like that a lot, right? So that's great. So in summary, it's like this problem is less vulnerable to memorization problem than it starts requiring LMs to forecast data from their training periods. But I would still like to, see explicitly detail why this is less of an issue. And I do not want to run the full analysis, but maybe if you can try with different variations of the prompt that does us just for the extracting from the text, which is a little bit subtle difference, and show that it's 99% correlated, then it should be fine, right? A little bit on the asset pricing. I'm not the biggest fan of the regressions of returns on past variables in a panel way, because basically the coefficients are not available in real time, so it's not obvious what would you do with this information. Now the simple solution is just to use the either Macbeth cross-sectional regression. So I know the conference calls are and this is not for the short-term returns, it's for the longer-term returns. I know different firms have different earnings call dates, but you can just pick, for example, April for Q1, get all of the conference call scores up until then, and then run the regressions on future returns. Yeah. So that will be fine. Obviously, the other thing you can do is portfolio sorts with a similar horizon, right? And obviously you can even do something better. So try to do some out of sample thing like a lasso regression, and then try to see if this actually forecasts returns going forward, right? There's a small econometric issue that affects some of the tables. So if you have fixed effects and lagged dependent variables, that typically is like not great, right? So in fixed effects panel regressions, a lag dependent variable on the right hand side is mechanically correlated with the mean error term, leading to bias estimates. So there's no correction for this. Normally it's like Arellano bond system, GMM, or there's many other things. The practical implication is that the coefficients for the lagged investment variables are biased downwards, right? So a lot of times they control for like lagged investment. So those coefficients would be biased downwards. The ChatGPT score itself is not highly collinear with the frame fixed effects. So its own coefficient is only indirectly affected, right, through the correlation with the lagged dependent variable. So this is unlikely to overturn any qualitative conclusion. But it's still a good idea to just do the correct econometrics, right? Okay, yes, and finally the last part. I do think the author do a very good job in what are the core economic insights from textual analysis. So like they do show that they have a good mechanism of why the manual private information would show up in the conference calls and not before. They do you do need, in order to get some predictability, you do need a little bit of market mean efficiency, but that's fine. That they work that with their model. They do the tables well, sorry. And I did like the part about why firms invest. So like, identifying, categorizing the economic rationales, and just trying to see how that affects. The obvious caveat that sometimes referees do not ask to use ChatGPT. Like they do not like when you use ChatGPT to classify its own explanations. I don't know why. I think it does a good job, but you can use whatever other topic modeling mechanism. They also do show some value in opaque environments, right? I do think this is a great paper. I do think in general, ChatGPT kind of models are the best at extracting data. And if you want to like just extract some information from the text, it's better than anything else that you can. I would like to see some comparisons using, for example, for the return predictions using some earlier methods like just dictionary methods or the CFO survey or any other thing. Yeah, but I think this is a very, very well developed paper. It's in a very late stage. So yeah, it was a little bit tricky to come up with the discussion, but I'm very happy to have been invited.
Right. Thank you very much, Alejandro. Michael, if you want to just take a minute or so to respond, and then we'll go ahead and go through some of the questions that have been asked in the Q&A.
Well, yeah, first of all, I want to thank Alejandro for a great discussion. Definitely a couple of things we can clean up and should clean up. Just a few things I wanted to briefly allude to. So like, I'm not super concerned about a nickel bias, given that like CapEx is only in a few specifications, but that's definitely something we should take care of. we also now implemented like some standard portfolio sorts, and results actually are similar. So in that sense, I don't think like the kind of forward-looking nature of like the firm fixed effects is kind of a big deal in that sense. And also like, we don't see it like as an asset pricing test or paper. It's mainly like a plausibility check. But again, like totally with you, that's something we should change in the paper, and we have the results already. I like the idea of potentially playing around a little bit with the prompt and then see like what the correlation is with our kind of answers from the current prompt. That's certainly a good point. We did actually like now look for a 10% subsample at the de-anonymized at the anonymized kind of earnings calls transcript, and try to de-anonymize it, and actually in fact didn't work all that well. So in that sense, I think actually it's good news for us, but I think that's something we should add to the paper. And it's like, now one thing I wanted to just briefly mention, this goes back to your point on memorization and effectively just kind of like rewriting what we know exposed. I think here I rely on what you were kind of presenting 10 days ago, that GPT at a worst time for smaller firms recalling exact information. Now for us it's exactly the opposite. Like we actually get stronger results for smaller firms. That's why I don't think that's just purely ChatGPT memorizing the exposed history. It's also the case that, for small firms, I don't think exposed we would see in the newspaper lots of discussion about their investment plan. And that's kind of like the environment where actually GPT seems to actually have an edge. And so in that sense, like I think it's indeed extracting content that the CFO discloses in the calls, but I think we can actually do and should more in the paper. Thank you.
All right, great. Thank you very much. Michael, this is actually related a little bit to one of Dido Badu's questions in the Q&A, right? So it says, how does firm heterogeneity, such as size, governance, industry concentration, affect the reliability of ChatGPT extracted policy scores?
Like, that's a great question. So, like, I would not sure how to answer the reliability, because, like, unless you can maybe specify what you have in mind with reliability. But so certainly, like, what we do see is that, the correlation with future realized investment and the ChatGPT extracted investment score is in fact stronger for firms and industries that are more competitive, but also for smaller firms. So in that sense, like if you think that's kind of like reliability, in fact, actually, like, it's becomes more reliable for smaller firms where maybe the concern of memorization is in fact lower.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So thank you. There's another question. I think you may have answered this through total Q, but intangible assets, right? Patents, brand value are undervalued in traditional Q calculations. Does the textual analysis method account for this? And I think a follow-up question the person asked was, are the ChatGPT scores adjusted for intangibles?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So, like, in our prompt, we did not explicitly kind of like ask ChatGPT to also kind of focus on intangible investment. Now, if you look at the score that it extracts or generates, to kind of look at the subcomponents, it seems to do have some predictive power for intangible investment, even though we don't explicitly kind of condition on that. But like, if intangible investment, at least in part, indeed kind of also kind of take future expected returns into account, you would expect that you would find this correlation with future intangible investment. That's the first thing. And the second thing, like, in terms of like, is kind of like the predictive power we find in a GPT score purely coming from standard Q measures, ignoring information about intangibles. The way we try to get at that is kind of like we use the kind of like the Luke Taylor and Peters measure of total Q that directly takes into account intangible investment to kind of, at least in part, kind of condition on that. And like if you use total Q versus standard Q as a covariate, you still see that kind of like the ChatGPT investment score is a very similar correlation with future realized investment. But definitely kind of like a great point, and like maybe worthwhile, in fact, actually for a subset explicitly prompted to kind of like extract a measure of intangible investment. Like, I would need to kind of also first get a feeling whether actually CFOs do talk about it and read a couple of those earnings transcript, but definitely worthwhile to think about it.
Okay, thank you. Another question we've had in the Q&A is, can ChatGPT-based investment scores trained on US firms generalize to non-US markets? And what linguistic, regulatory, or cultural factors affect their predictive performance globally?
Now, that's actually an interesting point. So, we haven't really looked at global data, but the type of text, of course, is available also for countries other than the US. And in that sense, we could easily extend it to other kind of contexts. Now, at the end of the day, what you would need is that the market doesn't know everything and that the managers want to disclose some of their private information of what they plan to do. I do think those are two conditions that maybe are not super kind of strong. And in that sense, applying it in different cultural contexts in Europe and Asia would be super interesting. Another thing kind of what people have done, starting in the mid-90s is kind of apply the estimated coefficient of a Kaplan-Zingales type index, and then for firms in Germany, which are maybe a little bit less confident that it's kind of too meaningful, but we could potentially check whether at least across industries and over time you see similar patterns also in Germany or maybe across Asian countries, and then kind of rather than running it yourself, you could then at least across industries and over time maybe just apply our findings from the US. But again, I think it's so simple to implement it in other kind of countries that I wouldn't actually just rely on kind of the cross-industry time variation that we find and just do it for other settings. And we can definitely look into that.
Right. This makes me wonder too, right? Like in terms of cultural, the question was about, cultural differences maybe, but what if the culture within a company changes in terms of how they express themselves during earnings call, because they know that ChatGPT is going to be listening in. And if that, that matters for stock, immediate stock reactions and maybe also cumulative returns, right? So it's like a cultural shift within the firm based on that knowledge that the ChatGPT is listening.
That's definitely super interesting. We haven't done it, but looking into whether the type of kind of disclosure you see in the way they talk about it, as you refer to, that's I can definitely see, and there is some evidence that the way managers talk when they know a machine is listening does actually change. And so definitely would be curious to kind of systematically look into that.
Yeah, very interesting. Want to see if anybody else has questions. We do have a few more. Marcus, go ahead.
Great paper, great discussion. Thank you very much. Last month, we had a speaker talking about look-ahead bias free language models, Asaf. I'm just wondering, I think he makes his code publicly available. It just seems to be a very easy way to address some of the comments that Alejandro brought up about the look-ahead bias. Of course, the question is the model as powerful as ChatGPT? There are other aspects to it, but
I had a similar question to Marcus, but to that point, right? You use ChatGPT 3.5, Michael, right? So I don't know what Asaf's, but I had that same comment. I wanted to bring up Asaf's work from last month.
No, that's actually an excellent point. It's on our to-do list to effectively exactly, do, I guess, Marcus, what you are hinting at, Asaf also being minus advisor. So that's definitely our to-do list, and maybe some shameful promotion of a conference. I see Andy now, Alberto Rossi, and Francesco D'Acunto and I are organizing in FITS now at the end of June in Switzerland. We actually have exactly that paper on the program, and I definitely want to talk to him about that in more detail, and definitely well taken and on the to-do list.
And one more comment. I know there's a very cheap comment, but I think part of your takeaways are that ChatGPT brings additional information relative to a measure like Tobin's Q or what the other controls are that you have. And that is in a linear regression context. And you have work yourself, right? Where you also push the points. There's no reason to believe that some outcome variables have to depend linearly on some features. And, it could be it's all the same informational content, but there's just some transformation going on, right? So I'm just wondering if there's some robustness that looks at how much does it depend on the linear regression context versus, is a functional form type of test that you're doing.
Oh, it's like I wouldn't know what I would call that cheap, but certainly a plausible comment and something we can look into. It's like the only thing we've done so far in terms of like whether the standard thing in this kind of Tobin skew type regression, whether measurement error is the major issue. So we use this cumulant type estimator of Ericsson and Whitehead, but we can certainly also look at nonlinearities. Like one thing that gives me a little bit of hope, like we did simple kind of sorts into different bins based on the ChatGPT investment score and looked at both the Duke CFO survey answer, but also future realized investment. And kind of there was this monotonic relationship. I think the next thing we could easily do before kind of like doing directly some nonlinear estimation, we can directly kind of orthogonalize investment with respect to Tobin's Q and use the residual in those simple sorts would be another kind of test we can easily, but definitely a plausible thing to look into.
Maybe a double sort, because if you're orthogonalized relative to Tobin's Q, you again assume there's a linear type of relationship. But I mean, there are a lot of ways how you can do it, obviously. Yeah.
Totally.
All right. Thank you very much to our speakers. Big round of applause, virtual applause. We're now going to enter the unrecorded discussion part where participants are going to be upgraded to panelists if they would like to continue their conversation. But before we do that, I'd like to announce our next webinar will be on June 26th, and Gabby Dufang will present his work on mosaics of predictability. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you to our speakers, and you can stay, and we'll upgrade you to panelists if you'd like to join the conversation.